Daniel Lawson walked into the bustling airport terminal, his sharp black suit and polished shoes a testament to his success. As the CEO of Infinity Airlines, one of the most prestigious carriers in the industry, he had spent years building his company into a global powerhouse. His influence stretched across boardrooms and corporate offices, yet here, at the check-in counter of his own airline, he was about to experience the same prejudice that countless others had endured before him. With his business class ticket in hand, Daniel approached the counter, expecting a routine check-in. The line moved at a steady pace, travelers handing over their passports and receiving their boarding passes without issue. But as he stepped forward, he noticed a shift in the attendant's demeanor. The woman behind the counter, a young employee with neatly tied blonde hair, barely glanced at him before returning her attention to her phone. Daniel cleared his throat politely. "Good afternoon. I have a reservation in business class for flight 308 to London." He slid his passport and ticket across the counter. The attendant, without looking up, let out a dramatic sigh, the kind reserved for someone dealing with an inconvenience. She picked up his passport lazily, scanned the screen, and then shook her head. "I don't see a reservation under your name," she said flatly, still not making eye contact. Daniel remained calm. "Could you check again? The reservation should be under Lawson." She exhaled loudly, clearly annoyed by the request. Tapping at the keyboard with deliberate slowness, she hummed under her breath, then shook her head again. "Nope, not here," she said, already reaching to hand back his passport as if the matter was settled. Behind him, the line of passengers grew longer, some shifting impatiently, while others watched the exchange with mild curiosity. Daniel could feel the unspoken tension in the air. He wasn't just being dismissed, he was being judged. He had seen this before, the subtle condescension, the assumption that he didn't belong. Still, he refused to let frustration show. He retrieved his phone and quickly pulled up the confirmation email from Infinity Airlines. Turning the screen toward her, he said, "Here's my reservation confirmation, booked directly through the airline. Could you please verify again?" The attendant barely glanced at the screen before offering a patronizing smirk. "Sir, maybe you made a mistake," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness. "This happens all the time. Are you sure you booked business class? Economy check-in is at the counter, over there." She gestured dismissively toward the long line of passengers waiting in economy. A white businessman standing nearby, adjusting his cheap tie and gripping his suitcase, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if amused by the spectacle. Daniel could feel the condescension radiating from both of them. The assumption was clear: a black man in an expensive suit must have made a mistake. He couldn't possibly afford business class. He couldn't possibly belong here. For a brief moment, Daniel considered explaining himself, but why should he have to? Why should he, the very CEO of the airline, have to justify his presence in a section he personally designed to accommodate elite travelers? Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "That won't be necessary," he said, tapping his phone screen. The attendant raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Sir, one don't know who you think you are, but business class has standards." Daniel let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching as the young woman spoke with complete confidence in her misplaced authority. She truly believed she was in control of this situation. Then his phone rang. "Yes, it's me," Daniel answered, his voice steady. "I need you to check something for me immediately." The check-in area fell silent. Even the businessman, who had been chuckling moments ago, stopped smirking, now watching with interest. The attendant huffed impatiently. "Sir, no phone calls at the counter," she snapped, her voice laced with irritation. Then her own desk phone rang. Startled, she picked up. "This is the check-in desk for flight 308 to London," she answered, her tone clipped. She listened for a few seconds, her eyes widening as her posture stiffened. "Wait, what?" Her voice faltered, her face drained of color as she glanced at Daniel, her hands trembling slightly. Daniel tucked his phone away and straightened his cufflinks, exuding the kind of effortless authority that came naturally to him. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice laced with polite amusement. The white businessman frowned, glancing between Daniel and the now visibly shaken attendant. "What's going on?" he muttered. The young woman swallowed hard, her once arrogant confidence crumbling. "Sir, one eye," she stammered, her fingers hovering nervously over the keyboard. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You were saying something about me not belonging in business class?" he prompted. The attendant's hands trembled as she quickly typed into the system, her eyes darting between the flashing alerts on her screen. Passengers in line began murmuring, sensing the sudden shift in power. A few feet away, a young black woman watching the entire exchange smirked and began pulling out her phone to record. Within moments, the truth was revealed. On the large digital screens displaying flight updates, a system-wide announcement flickered across the monitors. Effective immediately, Infinity Airlines reaffirms its commitment to exceptional service and inclusivity. Discrimination has no place in our company. The white businessman took a step back, gripping his suitcase tightly. His smug demeanor evaporated, replaced by genuine panic. The attendant looked like she wanted to disappear. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but what could she say now? Daniel watched her reaction, his expression unreadable. She had made a career-ending mistake, and they both knew it. Passengers in the terminal began whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others pulling out their phones to record what was clearly turning into a viral moment. Daniel remained composed, exuding nothing but calm authority. Adjusting his cufflinks one last time, he looked the attendant in the eye. "Go ahead," he said. "Double check. I'll wait." Revealing his true identity, the moment everything changed, the air inside the terminal was thick with tension. Passengers who had previously been focused on their own travels were now watching with rapt attention, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Daniel Lawson, standing tall in his perfectly tailored suit, remained calm and composed. Despite the disrespect he had just endured, the airline attendant, who had so carelessly dismissed him moments ago, now stood frozen, her face pale as she scanned the flashing alert on her screen. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. It was as if she had forgotten how to speak. The white businessman, who had moments earlier been adjusting his cheap tie with an air of smug superiority, now stood rigid, his eyes darting between Daniel and the panicked woman behind the counter. The entire check-in area fell into hushed silence, the only sounds being the occasional murmur from bystanders and the faint beeping of airport announcements overhead. Daniel didn't have to say a word, his presence alone commanded attention. He adjusted his cufflinks with slow precision, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. He could feel the power shifting, the very foundation of the interaction crumbling beneath the attendant's feet. "Sir, one," she stammered, her fingers trembling over the keyboard as she frantically double-checked the system. She already knew the answer. She had made a catastrophic mistake. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You were saying something about me not belonging in business class." His voice was calm, but pointed, allowing the weight of his words to settle over her like a heavy fog. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, their interest now fully piqued. A young black woman standing nearby had already pulled out her phone to record, sensing that this moment was about to go viral. She wore a knowing smirk, one that said, "This is going to be good." The white businessman let out an awkward chuckle, an obvious attempt to mask his growing discomfort. He clutched his suitcase handle tighter, his fingers turning white from the pressure. "Wait, CEO?" He forced another laugh, but there was an unmistakable edge of panic in his voice. "That's a joke, right?" His laughter died in his throat when Daniel turned his gaze toward him, raising a single eyebrow. "You tell me," Daniel responded simply. The weight of realization hit both the attendant and the businessman like a tidal wave. The attendant's hands shook visibly as she continued typing, her breath growing shallow as she scanned the name linked to the airline's executive account. There it was, staring back at her like a damning verdict: Daniel Lawson, Chief Executive Officer, Infinity Airlines. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd as the information sunk in. The attendant's hand flew to her mouth. "I didn't realize." Daniel nodded slowly. "No, you didn't." His tone remained steady, but there was an undeniable sharpness beneath his words. The businessman took a small step back, as if trying to physically distance himself from the disaster unfolding in front of him. He shook his head in disbelief, his arrogance melting into sheer panic. This can't be real," he muttered under his breath. Daniel took a slow, deliberate breath, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate precision, he gestured toward the large digital screens displaying flight updates. Almost as if on cue, a system-wide announcement flickered across the monitors, effective immediately. Infinity Airlines reaffirms its commitment to exceptional service and inclusivity. Discrimination has no place in our company. Passengers throughout the terminal stopped what they were doing to read the message. A few let out low whistles of admiration, while others exchanged knowing glances. More phones came out, recording the moment. The white businessman swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he looked from the screens to Daniel, then back to the horrified attendant. He suddenly seemed much smaller than before, his previous confidence completely shattered. Daniel gave a small, knowing smile. "Looks like corporate is watching," he remarked lightly. The murmurs grew louder. Several passengers shook their heads in disbelief, some whispering phrases like, "Unbelievable, and this is what happens when you judge people by their looks." The attendant opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was stuck, and she knew it. Daniel remained composed, his voice even. "You assumed I didn't belong because of how I look. Not because of my ticket, not because of policy, just because." The attendant flushed red, struggling to maintain any shred of professionalism she had left. "Sir, I deeply apologize," she stammered. Daniel held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't apologize to me," he said coolly. "Apologize to every person who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or devalued just because you assumed they weren't good enough." The white businessman suddenly grabbed his suitcase and muttered, "I'll just, board now," before practically sprinting toward the gate. Daniel smirked. "That's what I thought." The energy in the terminal had completely shifted. Just minutes ago, Daniel had been dismissed, assumed to be out of place. Now, the same people who had ignored him stared at him with respect, realization dawning on their faces. The attendant stood frozen, her career flashing before her eyes, and then security arrived. Two uniformed airline security officers strode into the scene, their expressions stern. But instead of directing their attention toward Daniel, their authoritative presence shifted to the now humbling figures of the businessman and the panicked attendant. Passengers in the terminal watched in stunned silence, phones still recording, as the businessman who had moments ago basked in his unearned privilege now looked down in humiliation. The attendant clutched the counter, her voice trembling. "Mr. Lawson, please. I didn't mean to." Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "Didn't mean to what?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Assume that a black man in a suit couldn't possibly belong in first class. That someone like me couldn't be the one running the very airline you work for." The weight of his words hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable. The attendant looked on the verge of tears, desperation shining in her eyes. "Please, sir," she whispered, "I made a mistake. I need this job." Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Maybe next time, you'll remember that professionalism is more than just wearing a uniform. It's how you treat people. He took a slow step forward, his tone calm but final. You thought you had the power here? Then, with one last glance at the two security officers standing behind her, he added, "But today, you learned who really does." Consequences for discrimination, a lesson in accountability. The silence in the terminal was thick with tension. Just moments ago, Daniel Lawson had been dismissed and humiliated, but now the entire power dynamic had shifted. The white businessman who had smugly assumed superiority was now pale with embarrassment, gripping his suitcase like a lifeline, while the airline attendant who had so confidently dismissed Daniel was visibly shaking. She stood frozen, her entire demeanor transformed from arrogant indifference to sheer panic. Daniel, however, remained calm and composed, his presence commanding the space without a single raised voice. He had exposed the truth, and now the ones who had tried to belittle him were left grappling with the consequences of their actions. The attendant struggled to find her words, her throat bobbing as she attempted to justify herself. "Mr. Lawson," she stammered, I deeply apologize." "I didn't realize," Daniel raised a hand, cutting her off. His voice was measured, unwavering. "Don't apologize to me," he said, his gaze steady. "Apologize to every person you've ever dismissed, disrespected, or devalued just because you assumed they weren't good enough." The attendant winced, as if his words had physically struck her. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers grew louder, some nodding in silent agreement, others still recording on their phones. The white businessman, still standing awkwardly nearby, let out a nervous chuckle, clearly desperate to distance himself from the unfolding disaster. "Well, I'll just board now," he muttered before grabbing his suitcase and practically sprinting toward the gate. Daniel smirked. "That's what I thought." The scene would have ended there, but justice was not finished unfolding. The airline's corporate executive team, alerted to the viral crisis in the making, had arrived. A breathless man in a dark suit rushed toward the counter, his forehead damp with nervous sweat. His eyes darted from Daniel to the trembling attendant, instantly piecing together what had happened. "Mr. Lawson," he gasped, adjusting his tie as he struggled to regain control of the situation. "We are so sorry for this incident. Please, allow us to make things right." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh, don't worry," he said smoothly. "I'm about to." The corporate executive swallowed hard, nodding furiously. "Absolutely, sir. This kind of behavior is unacceptable. We will conduct immediate training for all staff to prevent anything like this from happening again." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Training?" He let the word hang in the air, deliberately allowing the executive to feel the weight of his inadequacy. The executive fidgeted under Daniel's stare. "Yes, sir. Comprehensive customer service and diversity training." Daniel held up a finger, stopping him. "We're not stopping at training," he stated. His tone was sharp but controlled, leaving no room for argument. "Consider this your first and only warning. I expect a full internal review of this location and a complete overhaul of how customers are treated. I'll be personally overseeing the changes." The executive nodded frantically, his hands gripping the edges of his suit jacket as if to steady himself. "Understood, sir. We will begin immediately." By now, the entire check-in area was silent, all eyes on Daniel. No longer was he the overlooked black traveler standing in line, he was the man in charge, the one everyone now respected. Passengers who had once ignored him were now staring with newfound admiration. A few even clapped quietly, acknowledging what had just taken place. The young black woman who had been recording from the beginning simply shook her head, smirking. "This is going to be all over the internet," she murmured to herself. Daniel, satisfied that his message had been received, finally picked up his ticket and turned toward the business class boarding area, his rightful place. But before he left, he gave the attendant one final glance. She was still visibly shaken, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the screen in front of her. In her eyes was the realization that her career had just taken a devastating hit. "Lesson learned," Daniel said softly, before walking away. Reforming the airline's policies, a demand for real change. As Daniel Lawson walked toward the business class boarding area, his calm yet commanding presence left a lasting impression on everyone in the terminal. The scene that had just unfolded wasn't just about one instance of discrimination. It was about a systemic issue that had plagued people like him for too long. And if there was one thing Daniel knew, it was that change didn't come from apologies, it came from action. The airline's corporate executive, still standing near the check-in counter, wiped the nervous sweat from his forehead. He had expected a simple public relations fix, but it was clear that Daniel wasn't going to let this slide with a standard diversity training memo. Daniel stopped in his tracks and turned back, his sharp eyes locking onto the executive. "I assume you understand that this isn't just about me," Daniel said, his voice measured yet unyielding. The executive nodded quickly, eager to show compliance. "Absolutely, sir. We take these matters very seriously. Our staff will undergo immediate retraining to prevent further incidents." Daniel raised a hand, cutting him off. "Training isn't enough." The executive stiffened, momentarily thrown off. "Sir?" Daniel exhaled, adjusting his cufflinks with slow precision, his movements deliberate. "Training tells people what not to do," he said. "It doesn't change how they think. If you want real improvement, then we're not just talking about training, we're talking about accountability, enforcement, and leadership change." Passengers nearby, still hanging on to every word, exchanged impressed glances. This wasn't just a man seeking justice for himself, he was setting a new standard. The executive swallowed hard, knowing he had no choice but to agree. "Of course, Mr. Lawson, we will launch an internal review immediately. Every complaint will be investigated. If we identify patterns of discrimination, there will be serious consequences for those involved." Daniel nodded. "Good," he said, "because make no mistake, I'll be watching." The young black woman who had been recording the incident from the start let out a low whistle, shaking her head. "Damn," she murmured, clearly impressed. "That's how you change the system." Passengers throughout the terminal whispered among themselves, some applauding quietly, others nodding in silent agreement. The attendant who had dismissed Daniel earlier stood at the check-in counter, her hands still trembling as she processed what had just happened. She wasn't just in trouble, her entire career was on the line now, and Daniel wasn't done yet. He turned back to the executive. "One more thing," he said. The executive stood at attention, bracing himself. "Yes, sir." Daniel gestured toward the growing crowd. "What happened here is already going viral," he said. "If your airline wants to survive this, I suggest you get ahead of it. A public statement will be issued immediately, acknowledging what happened today. I wanted to include a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, immediate measures for improvement, and the promise of full transparency in the review process." The executive nodded furiously, scribbling notes. "Understood, sir." Satisfied, Daniel finally turned to board his flight. As he walked toward the first-class cabin, a few passengers stepped forward, offering nods of respect. Some even reached out for a quick handshake. They all knew they had just witnessed something historic, a moment that would force the airline industry to rethink how it treated its customers. For Daniel, this wasn't about humiliating one employee or one executive. It was about setting a new precedent, because real change doesn't happen behind closed doors. It happens in moments like these where the world is watching and the system has no choice but to evolve. A powerful gesture before takeoff, elevating others in the fight for respect. As Daniel Lawson walked toward the business class boarding area, he could feel the weight of the moment settling in. He had just forced an airline, his own airline, to confront its deep-rooted biases, and he had ensured that meaningful changes would be made. But his work wasn't done yet. Power isn't just about reclaiming what's yours, it's about using it to uplift others. And Daniel was about to prove that in the most profound way. As he stepped onto the luxurious first-class cabin, flight attendants greeted him with nervous but respectful smiles. Their posture was different now, their once apathetic customer service act replaced with genuine attentiveness. Even the flight captain had emerged from the cockpit, hat in hand, walking toward Daniel with a formal yet apologetic expression. "Mr. Lawson," the captain said, extending a firm handshake, "we sincerely regret the treatment you received today. Please allow us to personally ensure your comfort for the duration of this flight." Daniel shook the captain's hand, but didn't return the performative pleasantries. His eyes scanned the first-class cabin, then flickered toward the economy section just beyond it. There, he saw something, or rather, someone that made him pause. An elderly black gentleman, dressed in a modest but well-pressed suit, sat in an economy-class aisle seat, quietly flipping through the business section of a newspaper. His graying hair and worn leather briefcase suggested a life of wisdom and hard-earned experience. Yet here he was pushed to the back of the plane while lesser men claimed the seats of privilege. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but not in anger and determination. He turned back to the captain and the lead flight attendant, his voice measured yet firm. "Actually, there is something you can do." The flight crew stiffened, awaiting his request. Daniel tilted his head slightly, gesturing toward the older gentleman in economy. "Upgrade that man to my original first-class seat." The entire cabin went silent. The flight attendants exchanged quick, unsure glances, but they knew better than to question him now. Within seconds, they moved into action, walking toward the elderly passenger with an air of careful reverence. Daniel stood just beyond the curtain separating economy from first class, watching as the flight attendant leaned down to speak in hushed tones to the older man. The gentleman furrowed his brows in confusion, his hands instinctively adjusting his suit jacket. "There must be some mistake," the man said, shaking his head politely. "I didn't request an upgrade." "No mistake, sir," the flight attendant assured him, her tone noticeably different than before, gentler, more respectful. "Mr. Lawson has requested that you take his first-class seat." The gentleman looked up, his gaze meeting Daniel's. For a long moment, he simply stared, as if trying to process the meaning behind the gesture. Then, slowly, he rose from his seat, adjusting the lapels of his jacket before stepping forward. As he approached, Daniel extended his hand. The older man looked at it, then at Daniel, before clasping it in a firm handshake. His eyes were filled with something deeper than gratitude. They were filled with understanding. "I appreciate that, son," the man said, his voice low and steady, "more than you know." Daniel offered a small but meaningful nod. "I figured you would." The flight crew watched the exchange in stunned silence, as if witnessing something bigger than just an upgrade. They were witnessing a moment of justice, a quiet act that spoke louder than any policy change ever could. The passengers in economy, who had also witnessed the moment, murmured in quiet admiration. A few even clapped softly, nodding in recognition of what had just happened. As the gentleman settled into his rightful first-class seat, Daniel turned back toward the private executive suite he had booked. He hadn't just reclaimed his place, he had changed what that place meant. For years, men like the elderly professor had been told they were not enough, that their contributions were unseen, that their worth did not grant them access to privilege. Today, that narrative changed. As Daniel finally sank into his seat, a new flight attendant approached, her posture straight, her voice respectful. "Mr. Lawson, may we offer you anything before takeoff?" she asked carefully. Daniel exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax, the weight of the moment settling into something smoother, lighter. "Yes," he said with a smirk, completely at ease now. Just a smooth flight. And as the plane soared into the sky, justice had not only been served, it had been seen. The viral aftermath, a lesson that echoed beyond the terminal the next morning. Daniel Lawson sat in his penthouse office, sipping his morning coffee as he gazed out at the breathtaking city skyline. Normally, this was his moment of quiet, his time to reflect, before the relentless pace of business took over. But today was different. His phone buzzed non-stop on his desk, notifications flooding in faster than he could process. The events at the airport had ignited something far bigger than he had anticipated. Social media was on fire. News outlets had picked up the story, and his name was now everywhere. Curious, Daniel picked up his phone and began scrolling through the headlines. Black CEO humiliates racist airline staff, teaches a masterclass in power. Airline in crisis after CEO exposes discrimination at his own company. How one man turned an act of prejudice into a lesson for the world. His lips curled into a subtle smirk. He hadn't sought attention. His only goal had been to correct an injustice, to ensure that no one else in his position would have to fight for their rightful place. But now, it seemed, the world had taken notice. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Sawyer, his trusted assistant, stepped inside, smirking as she held up her own phone. "You're all over the internet, boss," she said, walking over to his desk. "Looks like you made quite the statement." Daniel set his phone down and took a slow sip of coffee. "I wasn't trying to go viral," he said smoothly. "I was just making sure people know that respect isn't optional." Sawyer chuckled. "Well, that flight attendant definitely learned her lesson. Word is the airline has already started implementing emergency diversity training to control the damage." Daniel arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. Training is a band-aid. The real problem isn't a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of consequences. And if they think a few PowerPoint slides are going to fix this, they're mistaken. Sawyer nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. "You'll love this part, though," she said, swiping through her phone. "That elderly gentleman you upgraded? Turns out he's a retired professor, spent decades teaching business ethics." Daniel's smirk deepened. Now that's the kind of man who belongs in first class. Sawyer tilted her head, watching him carefully. "So you really just gave up your seat for him? No cameras, no announcement, just did it?" Daniel shrugged. "Respect isn't about money or power. It's about making sure the right people get treated right." Sawyer grinned. "Well, I hate to break it to you, but the whole world saw it anyway. That video has been shared over 10 million times." Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Lesson learned. A global reaction. The story had taken on a life of its own. Celebrities chimed in on Twitter, calling it a masterclass in handling discrimination with dignity. Business leaders praised Daniel's approach, saying it was a brilliant example of leadership in action. Activists pointed out that his actions were a reminder that bias exists at every level of society, even for the most powerful among us. The airline, in full crisis mode, had already issued multiple statements. They promised policy changes, new training programs, and a full investigation into past complaints of discrimination. Daniel wasn't naive. He knew that much of this was damage control, a desperate attempt to save face in the wake of their very public humiliation. But still, if it meant real change, he was willing to push the issue further. And push he did. The next morning, Infinity Airlines announced a full corporate restructuring of its customer service policies. The regional manager of the airport in question resigned. The check-in attendant was officially dismissed. And, most importantly, a new oversight committee was created to ensure that incidents like this wouldn't just be swept under the rug in the future. For Daniel, this was only the beginning. A moment that changed more than just an airline. As Daniel glanced out over the bustling city below, He knew that this wasn't just about one flight or one airline worker's mistake. This was about power dynamics. This was about who gets to decide who belongs where. And for too long, that decision had been left in the hands of people who judged others based on their assumptions, not their merit. He had the power to change that, and he intended to use it. With a final glance at the viral headlines, Daniel placed his phone face down on his desk. He had a board meeting to attend and a new standard to set. The power of self-respect and standing for what's right life teaches us many lessons, but one of the most important is this: respect is not freely given, it must be claimed, reinforced, and protected. No matter how much we have accomplished or how much wisdom we have gathered, there will always be moments when our dignity is challenged. The real test is how we respond. For many of us who have spent decades working, raising families, and building our lives, we know what it's like to be overlooked or underestimated. We have seen people make assumptions based on appearance, age, or background without ever stopping to consider the truth. But one thing experience teaches us is that true power lies in how we carry ourselves, how we react, and how we demand the respect we deserve. Dignity in the face of disrespect. The story of Daniel Lawson is one we can all learn from. Despite being a CEO, he was treated unfairly simply because of the way he looked. But instead of arguing or reacting with anger, he remained calm, composed, and unshakable. He let the truth reveal itself, and in the end, it was his presence, his confidence, and his actions that commanded the respect he was initially denied. This is a reminder to all of us: we do not need to shout to be heard, nor do we need to fight to be seen. Sometimes, the best way to stand our ground is through quiet strength and unwavering dignity. Respect is earned through action. One of the greatest lessons life teaches us is that respect is not about money, status, or titles, it's about character. We have all had moments when people assumed we were less capable, less important, or less deserving simply because they did not see our full story. But here's what we know to be true: your worth is not determined by someone else's perception. Your presence is not up for debate. Your experience is valuable, and no one can take that away from you. Daniel Lawson did not just stand up for himself, he used his power to lift someone else up. By giving his first-class seat to a retired professor, he sent a message that was more powerful than any speech. True leadership is not just about winning for yourself, but ensuring that others get the respect they deserve. A legacy of strength and integrity. As we grow older, we think more about the legacy we leave behind. Will we be remembered for staying silent in the face of unfairness, or will we be remembered for standing tall and leading by example? Every time we demand respect, every time we stand firm in who we are setting an example for future generations. We are teaching them that respect is not a privilege for the few, it is a right for all. And that is why this conversation must continue. If this message resonates with you, let's spread it together. Like this video if you believe in standing up for yourself and others. Comment below, share your experiences of overcoming disrespect or injustice. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that inspire and empower. Share this video with your family, friends, and community, because respect should not just be expected, it should be enforced. Together, let's make sure that dignity and self-respect never go unnoticed.